times have you heard the overpopulation is the reason why we need stifling economic policies, expansive climate policies, and widespread population control? Literally, it's the myth that keeps getting disproven, but just won't seem to die. Hey, Pro-Life Gen, I'm Kristan Hawkins. Welcome to this new Explicitly Pro-Life podcast.
Abortions may be regulated, but not prohibited by state law.
There is no constitutional right to an abortion in this country anymore as of today.
Sadly, the overpopulation myth has helped to drive the expansion of abortion globally to crisis levels that are still in the United States we're suffering from, to the loss of nearly 1 million children from abortion every year. And the abortion numbers globally are even more shocking than here in the States. Underpopulation poses threats to our economy and security, something that we hear Elon Musk comment on frequently these days. Today's guest is one of the most prominent authorities on the subject of population control and the population, and I could think of no one better to have this conversation with. Our guest today is Stephen Mosher. He's an internationally recognized authority on China, population issues, as well as an acclaimed author and speaker. He has worked tirelessly since 1979 to fight coercive population control programs and has helped hundreds of thousands of women and families worldwide over the years. In 1979, Stephen was the first American social scientist to visit mainland China. He was invited there by the Chinese government, where he had to assess two government documents and actually witnessed women being forced to have abortions under their, at the time, one-child policy. Some of the abortions he witnessed there in China were even late-term abortions. He was a pro-choice atheist at the time, but witnessing these traumatic abortions led him to reconsider his convictions and actually led him to become a practicing pro-life Roman Catholic. Stephen has appeared on numerous times before Congress as an expert in world population, on China and human rights abuses. He's been on Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham's show, other Fox News programs, EWTN, Good Morning America, you name it, he's probably appeared on it. His recent book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics, is an expose of COVID-19 as a bioweapon produced by Communist China using U.S. technology and some U.S. funding provided by Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's also the author of the best-selling A Mother's Ordeal, One Woman's Fight Against China's One-Child Policy, and a number of other books. His articles have appeared everywhere you get your news. New York Post, Epoch Times, Wall Street Journal, Reader's Digest, The Washington Post, you name it. So Steve, I want to get right to you today because this episode we did a couple months back on the Explicitly Pro-Life podcast, it was the most watched podcast episode ever. But yet so much has happened since that first episode we had together. So I had to get you to come back on to give us your take on what's happening. So welcome, and let's get right to the point. Is overpopulation a threat to our world?
Well, Kristan, it's great to be with you again. And, you know, it's interesting we should do the show now because coming up is a milestone. In November, we expect baby 8 billion to be born, the first time the planet Earth will hold 8 billion human beings. And the question is, I mean, is this a milestone on humanity's upward path that we should celebrate? Or is it an impending, the other side says it's a catastrophe, we should despair. Well, I believe it's something we should celebrate. I mean, just about 15 years ago, we celebrated the birth of baby 7 billion. And you might think, okay, well, we're getting to baby 8 billion fairly quickly. People need to know that we will probably not ever reach 9 billion. The population is going to peak in a couple of decades, and then it's going to begin its roller coaster ride downward, because birth rates are falling everywhere. And as that roller coaster hits its peak and begins downward, it's going to accelerate. Our long-term problem is not going to be too many people or too many babies. It's going to be too few people and too few babies. So I think we should celebrate the birth of baby 8 billion. I mean, look, the whole history of humanity has shown that as our numbers grow, our prosperity and well-being grows even faster. People don't remember, because they weren't alive in 1800, when there were only 1 billion of us in the year 1800, the global average per capita income was about $100. By 1927, our number had doubled to 2 billion, but incomes had already increased to 500. By the time we reached 3 billion in 1960, incomes had tripled. Again, 2011, population reached 7 billion, per capita income went up to 9,000. Anyway, we're on an upward trajectory here. Why? Because babies are blessings and not burdens, because babies in an open economy produce more than they consume, and so they're economic assets. Of course, they're gifts from God as well. They're irreplaceable human beings, each with an immortal soul. But looking at it from the sheerly economic point of view, every baby born contributes more over his or her lifetime than they will consume, assuming they're born into an open society where they're allowed to use their God-given talent. So the birth of baby 8 billion in November of 2022 is something we should celebrate.
That's awesome news. Why is the left just so wrong on this? Why do they keep, espousing this overpopulation myth? And I'm assuming now in November, we're going to see all these doomsday articles being written again about, baby 8 billion and what it means. Why do they keep doing this?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons, answers to that question, Kristan. One is that they're being paid to do it. There are billions of dollars being put into the pockets of people who propagate this anti-people propaganda. I mean, literally, I estimated a few years ago that they had $10 billion, $15 billion a year to spend on propaganda, anti-natal, anti-people propaganda. It comes from where? Well, it comes from the U.S. Treasury. It comes from your tax dollars and mine, in part, because the U.S. government has a big population control program. It comes from the United Nations Population Fund. It comes from the European Union. It comes mostly, interestingly enough, from countries that are already dying. Countries like Japan, countries like Great Britain, Sweden, that are filling more coffins than cradles each year. More people are dying than babies are being born. They're big funders of population control. It's almost as if they're saying, if we don't have any babies, you can't have any babies either, to the rest of the world. But if you look at the global picture, all right, you can see every continent except Africa now has birth rates that are below replacement rate. I used a technical term, replacement rate. What is replacement rate? Well, replacement rate is the rate of birth rate at which a population would replace itself. In other words, it would no longer be increasing, but it would no longer be decreasing. It would be zero population growth. That's 2.1 children per couple. So if every couple had 2.1 children, the population of the country they lived in would not increase, it would not decrease. Every continent of the world now, Asia, Africa, not Africa, but Asia, Latin America, Australia, Europe, has a birth rate that is below replacement rate. The only exception is Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason Africa is an exception is very, very interesting. It's an exception because they still have high infant and child mortality rates. A lot of little kids die in Africa shortly after birth or before their 5th birthday. And where couples see that their children are not going to survive to adulthood, what do? Well, they're rational. They have more children. They have an insurance child or two. So the birth rate in Nigeria is 5 children per couple, because couples fear that 1 or 2 or 3 of their children may not survive to adulthood. If you want to reduce the population growth, if you want to reduce the birth rate, the first thing that has to happen is you reduce the infant and child mortality rate. And then couples will decide to have fewer children naturally. I'm not advocating they do that. I'm just saying that's the way it's always worked. That's the demographic transition. That's the way it worked in the United States and Europe and Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and all those other dying countries. First, the infant child mortality rate came down, and then the birth rate came down a generation later. The only big exception to that was China, where they forced the birth rate down because of the one-child policy.
And I mean, this is why it's so interesting. You have Elon Musk, who I think kind of calls himself a futurist, and he's been tweeting and speaking publicly about this in the past few months, saying he feels like this is, while the left will say the greatest threat to humanity is climate change, man-made climate change, he's saying, no, it's the lack of population. And I think when he says it, it throws a lot of people through a loop, because they're like, what are you talking about? Because all they hear from the mainstream media is how we're overpopulated. Can you expand upon why from his perspective do you think he's so concerned?
Well, because Elon Musk is a manufacturer. He actually makes things. He has factories that make spaceships and electric vehicles, Teslas. He makes other things. So if you're a manufacturer and you have factories that make things, you have to hire people to actually assemble the products that you make. So he's in the business of hiring people, and he realizes that it's not always easy to hire qualified people. Why? Because the people aren't available. Maybe the person who would have designed the rocket ship that he's going to send to the moon was killed 40 years ago in an abortion in the United States. He faces real labor shortages, and he has his feet on the ground and not his head in some metaverse somewhere where his imagination is free to reign. I do think another reason most of the globalists, most of the billionaires, especially the ones in Silicon Valley, the masters of the universe who made their billions by inconveniencing electrons, these guys who really have no real world experience because they're always dealing day and night in a cyber world, an imaginary world. Those people, I think, are the worst kind of elitists, because they have fallen for the myth, as Warren Buffett has, as the old Ted Turner did, as George Soros does, fallen for the myth of overpopulation, that there are too many people on the planet. And I have to say that they have, I think, a disdain, not just for the poor. I think people like that, the new billionaires, the newly minted billionaires, and some of the old billionaires like Warren Buffett, really despise the rest of humanity. They think that a life lived with an income of less than, say, $1 million a year is not worth living. They really do look down on the rest of us and want to reduce our number. They don't realize that the only reason they've been able to accumulate great wealth is because humanity has assisted them in doing it. They didn't build it, as it were. They didn't make that money by themselves. They had the help of, in the United States, of 330 million, productive Americans busily creating their own lives and families and having children, providing for the future.
And buying their products. I think now facing this coming down off of the COVID crisis, the president has said the pandemic is over before he said it's still a pandemic, but whatever. Everyone is seeing these labor shortages of where did all these people go? Why can't, why isn't the service industry bouncing back? And why is it everywhere you go, you've got to wait longer to get whatever goods you've ordered? And everyone says it's a labor shortage. And I think this is probably a small taste of what is to come. I want to go back to a point you were talking about, to China, their imposed one-child policy. You have a book, Bully of Asia, and you talked a lot about their policies and the effect of their policies. Can you give us kind of an update as to what's going on in China right now? We know that they've kind of amended that one-child policy, but what's going on now? What should kind of concern us? And are there any, I guess, actions that are meaningful that we pro-lifers can take to counteract the bully of Asia?
Well, that's a pretty broad question, but let's start with the
Sorry.
one-child policy. It ran from 1980. It ended in 2016. Okay, the one-child policy was a policy of telling every couple in China that they were only allowed one child, and they could only have that one child when the Communist Party gave them permission to do so. All right, so it was a planned birth policy that involved forced abortion, forced sterilization, forced contraception, and the killing of babies after birth who were born with any sort of birth defect. So it was a eugenics policy as well. It would have made Margaret Sanger proud. I was in the operating room when they were doing forced cesarean sections on women who were 7 months pregnant, 8 months pregnant, and 9 months pregnant. That was way back in 1980. The policy continued, as I mentioned, until 2016. Over the course of that 36 years, the Chinese Communist Party killed 400 million unborn children in China. So the death toll, the Communist Party of China is the biggest killing machine in human history. Not only did they kill about 100 million Chinese after they were born, they killed 400 million, by their own accounts, by their own numbers, 400 million babies before they were able to draw their first breath. So the death toll is a neat 500 million. That's 500 million people that the Chinese Communist Party, until recently, bragged about eliminating from its population. A few years ago, they were saying, we've contributed to the solution to global warming by eliminating all these people from our population. No, they haven't. They contributed to making themselves a moral monster. They contributed to making themselves poor, and they contributed to the fact that China is now a dying country. China, the most populous country in the world, is filling more coffins than cradles. Why? Because they eliminated 400 million human beings.
And they're also still the biggest polluters in our world.
Absolutely.
Too, sure.
Every 2
Just
weeks,
saying.
every 2 weeks, China is opening up a new coal-fired power plant. All right. Now, I don't think that CO2, carbon dioxide, which is a trace gas on which all life depends, is a major threat. I don't worry about sea levels rising and inundating us all in 100 years. Anyway, that's another topic for another day. But China in 2016 woke up to the fact that it had a labor shortage. How do you create a labor shortage in the most populous country on the planet? Well, you do it by eliminating 400 million of the most productive, enterprising people on the planet, all these hundreds of millions of Chinese babies who were killed. So they went to a two-child policy. And what did Chinese young people do? Did they suddenly start having children? No. They looked up in astonishment and they said, wait a minute, Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership, you told us not to have children. You told us to delay getting married. You told us to have few children and have only quality children. And now you're telling us to have two? It didn't happen. They didn't respond. Last year, they went to a three-child policy in desperation, saying to the Chinese people, you are now free to have 3 children. Guess what? There's not even been a baby boomlet in China, much less a baby boom. The birth rate has continued to fall. There are now more abortions in China every year than there are live births. So the problem is getting worse, not better. I'm very much afraid, Kristan, that in the future, we will see not forced abortions, but forced pregnancies in China. Would the Communist Party hesitate to breed more human beings if they thought that the economy needed more workers? No, of course not. I mean, the same government that would force young women who are 9 months pregnant to have cesarean section abortions would not hesitate to force young women to bear children. I mean, this would be the Handmaid's Tale come to life.
Gosh, what would the liberal activists in America do then? They would actually they could actually get their Handmaid's Tale costumes out and put them to good use. That's something I've never thought about, but you're right on. That's probably a discussion that they're having because, I mean, if they think that they have the power to end human life, why not be able to force human life as well? I think that's an interesting discussion. And I know I did a whole podcast mini series about a year ago about communism and socialism. This is the result. This is what socialism brings when the state believes it has the actual power to tell you when you can have children, how many children you can have, what children are allowed to be born, and they can even force you to have children because it's for the greater good. And for them, human beings are completely disposable. So no, you can't be pro-life and be pro-socialism. So just throwing that out there, and there's a whole podcast mini series on that, because I've heard that a lot from more liberal-leaning pro-life students of they're so pro-life, they're for socialism, and those two things can't coexist at all. What can we do as pro-lifers, to talk about what's happening in China and to really raise that level of concern?
Well, I think that pro-lifers need to act on their convictions. I think young people need to understand that
Have more babies.
I was
Got that down.
exactly that. I mean, this is a life well lived. Get married, have children, have lots of children, form a family. You'll be doing not just a good deed for yourself. You'll be doing a good deed for your community, for your country, and for, of course, for your faith. Because those who read the Bible understand that the first commandment given our first parents, be fruitful and multiply, has never been rescinded. God doesn't change his mind. So I think planet Earth was designed to hold us as our numbers and our needs grew. I think the whole history of humanity shows that our God-given intelligence, as our numbers and our needs have grown, our God-given intelligence has enabled us to unlock resources so that as more of us exist on the planet, we're able to exist at a higher standard of living, live longer, better educated, and so forth. So that's the message. And we need to take back control of the government of the United States. We need to get the government out of the business of telling people around the world how many children they should have or shouldn't have. We not only shouldn't do that at home, we shouldn't do that overseas in Africa, Asia, and Latin America either. It's really none of our business.
That's absolutely right on. Virtual high five for you. Your newest book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics, I think was really a very interesting read, because not only are you this expert on China and demographics, I think it's really important to get your take as a social scientist on the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're, as I mentioned earlier, we're still dealing with the fallout now, both of the pandemic and then now the bad policies that were enacted during the pandemic that Democrats said we needed. I mean, these policies, were the ones where the administrators and the government officials were allowing abortion facilities to stay open, putting getting PPE, personal protective equipment, into abortion facilities over hospitals, handing them millions, if not billions, in taxpayer funding and small businesses loans, which they took illegally and never gave back. Politicians using the crisis of COVID to radically expand access to chemical abortion drugs, which we know are extremely harmful to women, not just deadly to children. And so we have the pandemic, the crisis itself of the pandemic. Now we have the crisis of all the bad policies that were enacted when it came to the pandemic, when it came to abortion. What happens if, and I think the left has gotten excited about the COVID pandemic because it gets to do what it wants to do, which is tell all of us how to live our lives. I'm thinking that in a year or so, we're going to have a new crisis, a new disease, a new pandemic will be discovered. And they'll be, looking for ways to enact control, to use it to hold on to their control in Washington, D.C. What can we do differently to get better results next time a pandemic emerges?
Well, I think the pandemic came from China. I wrote in February of 2020, I was the first one to point out that all roads led to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I believe it was created there using gain-of-function research. Actually, the techniques were developed in the United States, and Dr. Anthony Fauci trained Chinese scientists and funded indirectly through a group called EcoHealth Alliance, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. When he was told he couldn't develop dangerous monster Frankenstein viruses in American labs, he moved his project overseas to China. And the result was the Chinese bioweapons experts and the People's Liberation Army were very happy that the naive and innocent Americans led by Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins, the head of the NIH. We're not only teaching them how to develop dangerous new bioweapons, but also funding their projects. And the end result was the virus that causes COVID, SARS-CoV-2, which was released in vaccine trials in Wuhan, and then from there deliberately spread around the world. Let me back up and say it was created in the lab. They had the virus. They were working on a vaccine to protect their own people against the virus. When it leaked out, as sometimes happens during vaccine trials in Wuhan, once it leaked out in the city of Wuhan, a city of 12 million people, the Chinese Communist Party leaders made a deliberate decision to spread it around the world. They stopped flights from Wuhan from going to Chinese cities, but they allowed flights from Wuhan, the city of Wuhan in China, to go to Madrid, to go to Milan, to go to New York City and other places. So that's in short, the history of the China virus, as I call it. And I believe that perhaps lurking in a test tube somewhere, perhaps in the Wuhan Institute of Virology itself in Wuhan, China, is another COVID virus, is another coronavirus that will be released at the appropriate time. Now, the astonishing fact to me was that when the pandemic finally began to be acknowledged in the rest of the world, after China had hid it for months on end within China, after China had gotten the World Health Organization to lie about human-to-human transmission, when we finally woke up to the threat from China, what our experts did at that point was criminal. They called their Chinese colleagues, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Dr. Deborah Birx from Washington, D.C., were calling their Chinese colleagues, quote unquote colleagues, who told them that the only thing that you could do to combat the spread of the virus was to lock everybody in their homes, to close down the schools, and for goodness sake, if anybody got sick, you had to put them in the hospital, tape their mouths shut, sedate them, and intubate them, and pump their lungs full of pure oxygen. All of those things were gross public health mistakes. The lockdowns killed a lot of people all by themselves. The closure of the schools held back kids from being educated for a year or two. Education is positively related to lifespans. The more you know, the longer you tend to live. These kids who are deprived of a year or two of education will actually see their lifespan shortened just because of that alone. Anyway, why did we ever take our marching orders on how to deal with the pandemic that was created in China by a virus that was created in a Chinese lab? Why did we ever import their model of control in the United States? And I think we found out very quickly in the opening stages of the pandemic that there were lots of socialist, leftist politicians in the United States who just rubbed their hands with glee over the thought that now they would have the power, using the excuse of the pandemic, to promote their friends and punish their enemies. And so the churches got closed. The pro-life counseling centers got closed. And as you say, they kept the Planned Parenthood abortion clinics open. So would they do it again? Would China do it again? Yeah, there's been no accountability. Would certain politicians in the United States relish the coming of another pandemic so they could continue to enjoy these extraordinary powers to control our lives, where we go, what we buy, what we eat, whether or not we can even leave our homes? Sure they would. Sure they would.
Wow. I think that the lesson is for us, we have to be very, vigilant when the next pandemic comes out of China, to ensure that our political leaders don't do what they did during COVID. And I guess it'd be extra vigilant to see how the abortion industry quickly reacts and uses a crisis to expand and promote their abortion business. Really it comes down to who's in political power when this crisis comes, and then the next crisis comes up. Is that what you would say? Absolutely.
Yeah, we have to call China to account because if they pay no price for killing millions of people around the world and causing literally tens of trillions of dollars of economic damage, if they pay no price for releasing the last virus on the world, why wouldn't they do it again? I mean, it's the most successful weapons attack in the entire history of humanity. And we also see, of course, in our country, where there are a lot of people who are averting their eyes. Now, whether they've been captured by the Chinese Communist Party, whether they've been given, their family members have been given bribes in order to do the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party, it is, a topic for which we don't have time today. We could talk for hours about the successful efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to corrupt and compromise members of the American political elite, including, some would say, the first family of the United States. We now have, of course, a president who says the pandemic is over, but we also realize that he's not really in charge.
The administration quickly tried to go back on that.
Well, and they do that again and again. I mean, he said, for example, recently that we would defend Taiwan if it were attacked, and immediately unnamed anonymous sources in the White House say, well, that's not really U.S. policy. U.S. policy hasn't changed. So it's frightening because we really don't know who's in charge of the U.S. government. The second, third tier people we do know are radicals. They're radicals in the sense that they want abortion up to and after birth. They're radicals in that they want to impose, policies that tax families, that double tax couples, and that discourage the birth of children. So we still live in a democracy, and we all have to do our civic duty when election time comes, and we have to vote for people who are pro-life from conception to natural death.
That's right. That is it. We've got to continue voting, and I think kind of raise our minds to, it's not just if we're funding Planned Parenthood or the one bill that's in Congress right now to prevent or restrict abortions. It goes well beyond that when you look at this total worldview of who our elected officials and the worldview that our elected officials have and who they think they have the right to control and what they think they have the right to control in our lives and how that relates to the global problem of abortion. Steve, thank you so much for your expertise and all that you continue to do at Population Research Institute. Where can folks go to? I know a lot of people are going to listen to this and be like, oh my gosh, I need to read every book this man's ever written. Where can they go to get all this information?
Well, our website is pop.org. pop.org. That stands for Population Research Institute. I'm a pop, of course. I have 9 children. So you have to live out your faith. You have to act on your beliefs. And my wife and I are very pro-life, and we're now welcoming grandchildren into the world. And there's no joy like welcoming a child or a grandchild into your life. So come to pop.org. You can find my books on our website. Of course, you can get them from Amazon.com as well. And a lot of material. When you find yourself in discussions with people about whether or not there are too many people on the planet, come to our website. We'll give you the talking points. You will win the argument. The facts are on our side.
You guys have some great videos. When you're on pop.org, look for Steve's videos. They have animated videos they put out over the years that just completely dispel all of this nonsense that you hear. You will absolutely win the argument after you watch some of these videos. And you heard it from Steve. Get married, be fruitful, multiply, have lots of babies too. So that's the other way we can win this war. Thanks so much, Stephen, for all that you do and what you do at the Population Research Institute. Thank you all for tuning in this week, this special Explicitly Pro-Life podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. It is alarming, but it is an important conversation that we must have now before it's too late. Bye, everyone.